Okay, so how hard should you train to maximize muscle growth? Should you always be pushing to muscular failure so that at the end of each set you aren't able to do another rep anymore? Or is there maybe a benefit of stopping your sets before that point and keeping a few repetitions in reserve? Well, a few months ago, a new research paper came out that found that the harder you train, so in other words, the closer you push yourself to muscular failure, the more muscle mass you're going to build. So this means that pushing yourself hard is definitely important, but does it also mean that you should push every single set to failure if you want to maximize muscle growth? I would say probably not, and training in that way can also have a negative impact on other training variables that will also be important for building muscle mass. And so in this video, we're going to be looking at 5 factors that you want to consider when thinking about how hard you want to be pushing yourself in the gym if your goal is to maximize muscle growth. So let's get started. So factor number 1 is how much training volume you need to make optimal progress. So on a per set basis, I would say it's probably best if you push all the way to muscular failure. But research also shows that this causes a disproportionate amount of fatigue compared to if you would keep a few repetitions in reserve. And so that will extend the time period that it takes you to recover from that type of training. So that means that if you're always pushing every single set to the max, then you won't be able to train that muscle group as frequently. And in terms that will have a negative impact on how much training volume, so how many sets you're able to do per muscle group per week. And because research shows that up to a certain point, doing higher training volumes are better than doing lower training volumes, we need to find a way of balancing how close we go to failure with how much training volume we're doing during the week. Anecdotally, both very low volume approaches, where you're pushing every single set to the max, as well as very high volume approaches, where you're keeping quite a few reps in reserve on each set, have produced great physiques. So you'll have to figure out what works best for you. So this can be very individual, but as a very rough guideline, I would say doing at least 10 sets per muscle group per week and keeping 1 to 2 reps in reserve is a very decent starting place for most people. So the next factor you want to consider is what exercise you're doing. So if you're doing compound exercises, I generally like to keep at least 1 repetition in reserve. So these are your multi-joint exercises, so your squats, your deadlift variations, any kind of pressing, any kind of pulling, so rowing variations, pull downs, pull-ups. And because you can use quite a lot of weight on these exercises, if you're always pushing them to failure, it can be very fatiguing for your nervous system. So in sports science, we call this central fatigue. And if this is very high, it can negatively impact your performance on other exercises, as well as on other training sessions during the week. And there's also a safety concern with some of these exercises. So for instance, if you're doing a barbell squat or a bench press, then going all the way to failure can potentially be dangerous, especially if you don't really have a good spotter. So I personally keep 1 to 3 RIR, which stands for repetitions in reserve, on my barbell compound exercises, and then on any kind of rowing variation, or any kind of machine work or dumbbell exercises, I keep about 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve on the first few sets, and then on the last set I go all the way to failure. On isolation exercises, I don't think it's that big of a deal if you take every single set to failure, because there isn't a lot of central fatigue with these exercises. But what I generally do is on the first few sets, I'll keep about 1 repetition in reserve, and then on the last set I'll just go to the absolute maximum and do as many repetitions as I can. Factor number 3 is what training loads you're using. So if you're training with very heavy weights, then it probably becomes increasingly less necessary to push all the way to failure. Just because from the very first repetition onwards, you'll be using all of your muscle fibers, and you'll also be very close to failure from the get-go. Just because if you're using a weight that you can only do 5 or 6 repetitions with, after you've done the first repetition, by default, you'll already only have a couple of reps in reserve. So where exactly that cutoff point isn't very clear, but I think if you're training it with anything that is heavier than your 8 repetition maximum for a given exercise, then you probably don't have to go all the way to failure, and keeping about 2 to 3 repetitions in reserve is probably sufficient. If on the other hand, you're training with the more traditional 8 to 12 repetitions or 8 to 15 repetitions, or using very light weights and very high repetitions, then I think it becomes increasingly more important that you push very close, if not all the way to failure. And the reason for that is that the higher the repetitions are that you're using, so in other words, the lighter the weights are, the more inaccurate people normally become at judging how close to failure they are. And so if you are training with weights that you can do 15, 20, or maybe even 30 repetitions with, then I'd advise you to at least take the very last set of every single exercise to failure, just to keep yourself honest. The next factor that's going to influence how close you want to be training to failure is your training age. So if you're a beginner, then you don't really need to stress out over this topic that much, because you're so far away from your genetic ceiling that even if you are leaving quite a few reps in reserve on every single set, you'll probably still grow muscle optimally. So you just want to focus on going to the gym consistently, making sure that you learn the correct technique on every single exercise, go through a full range of motion, and then slowly start adding weight and reps over time. And then by default, you'll get closer and closer to failure anyway. If you are intermediate, then it's probably a lot more important to pushing yourself a little bit harder in the gym. And so what you want to do there is probably take the last set of every single exercise to failure, because that will teach you how to train hard and know what failure actually feels like. Because training to failure is a skill like everything else. So once you're able to do that, and once you're able to keep your technique consistent, even while pushing yourself to the maximum, it'll be a lot easier for you to know what keeping 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 repetitions in reserve actually feels like. And it'll also be a lot more accurate. If you've never done that before, then you might think that you've only got 2 repetitions left, when in reality you might have 4 or 5 repetitions left, and that will make that set a lot less effective. If you're more advanced, then there can be a case made for you having to push to failure more often, but even then I would say it's probably still smart to keep at least 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve on most sets, just because you'll also have to do more volume, and because training to failure is more fatiguing, like we learned earlier, you'll still have to find the right balance between how hard you want to push each set and how many sets you want to do during the week. Factor number 5 that's going to impact your training intensity are individual differences. So obviously you have the personal enjoyment factor. Some people just absolutely love training to failure, and even if they know that doing so is probably not the best if they want to make the most progress possible, they're still going to do it just because they enjoy it. But I would say for most people, it's quite mentally draining, always having to push to the maximum every single set. So for them, it's probably not sustainable to train in that way. So for them, like I said before, probably best to keep 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve on most sets, and then on your last set, take that set to failure. And then some people can just push themselves to the absolute limit on every single set for years and years and be completely fine. Whereas someone else, as soon as they push to failure, they'll injure themselves or their joints will hurt. So if you're someone like that, who is quite prone to injury, then I would say you want to take more of a conservative approach and maybe even keep 2 to 3 repetitions in reserve on basically all of your sets. Even though that might not be the best on a per set basis in terms of stimulus, it probably is best for you if that means that you're not injuring yourself and that you can train consistently for a long period of time without having to take time off from training. With all that being said, in my opinion, most people simply don't train hard enough. Like if you're in a public gym and you have a look around, then you'll see that most people are just going through the motions, and at the end of each set, they could have done 4 or 5 or sometimes even 10 repetitions more. And so if you're wondering if you are training hard enough, then chances are you're probably not training hard enough. And I would take that approach that I've outlined in this video. So at least take the last set of every single exercise to failure, if you can do so safely. And then for all the other sets, you want to at least push yourself so far that the last repetition is considerably slower than the repetitions before that. That will just mean that you fatigue your muscle in a way that it can't produce as much force anymore, and will make sure that your set was actually effective at stimulating muscle growth. If on the other hand, you're someone who always pushes every single set to failure, like I used to, then I hope this video has also been helpful in explaining that that's probably also not the most optimal way of training, just because you'll always be fatiguing yourself so much that will hinder how often you're able to train that muscle group and how much volume you'll be able to do. So in that case, just make sure that you keep 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve on most sets, and then on the last set, you can go all the way to failure. And if you want to learn what rep range you need to be training in to make the most progress possible, then just go and check out my last video where I explain that topic in detail. So that's it for this one, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you have any other questions regarding training intensity, just drop a comment down below. Make sure that you like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.